Good evening. Chair of today's program, Dr. Harshad, Honorable Member of Parliament, Supriya Taiji, organizers of this program, Yashwantrao Chauhan Center, and distinguished participants in today's dialogue. At the outset itself, let me express my thanks and gratitude to Yashwantrao Chauhan Center for inviting me for this talk and also allowing me to speak on India's aspirational foreign policy. Some of us, or rather many of us, would get an impression that the word aspiration got inducted into the dictionary post 2014. That's certainly not true, but it is certainly true that it has got added to our vocabulary post 2014. Because now we are looking at many things from the aspirational perspective. What we have achieved so far and what we want to achieve in the near future and in the distant future. As Supriyatai was explaining, that India really has become aspirational, and different segments, they have become aspirational. I would also like to share a small incident that has really opened or that has given a glimpse of how aspirational we have become. Some 12 years ago, I went to Wardha for some field work, and in the afternoon I was at the Wardha bus stand, and I noticed that suddenly around 12:31 up to 2:30, the bus stand was full of rural girls and boys who have converged in Wardha in the morning, attended their schools, junior college, senior college, and then all of them were going back to their villages. And they were literally in hundreds. The entire bus stand was full of only of the students in uniform, without uniform, but the adolescent girls and boys who were there. That was not something that I could see in my childhood in Vidarbha or at other places or so. So that aspiration of getting education, achieving something in life, and transforming our lives, transforming lives of our family, it has now reached to the downtrodden. It has reached to the last family in India, last persons in India. And it is quite obvious that that is also getting reflected in different policies that India is adopting, trying to implement, and so as in India's foreign policy as well. However, I would like to state that India's foreign policy, it has been aspirational from the beginning itself. The aspirations might be little different earlier and little different now, but India's foreign policy has been extremely aspirational from the beginning. Now, if we look at the word aspiration, its dictionary meaning says that a strong desire to achieve something great or big. So a strong desire to achieve something big or something great. It has always been there in India's foreign policy from the beginning. And it is also little ambiguous because it talks about something. So what is that something that India's foreign policy, it has been trying to achieve? What is it that we are trying to get through our foreign policy? Now, aspiration is something that is somewhere in between a set goal and a dream. Aspiration is not a dream. Aspiration is achievable, but you really need to put up a lot of efforts to achieve it. It is not a simple goal. It is beyond the goal that you can set in your life, that you can set for your country, that you can set for your department or so. That is achievable. But aspiration is something that is beyond that, but it is also not a daydream. So something achievable, but for which you really need to put up a lot of efforts. And if we look at what were our aspirations in the past, and if we compare it to the present, we could see a kind of continuity and lot of changes as well. When India became independent, the biggest aspiration in India's foreign policy was to adopt and implement, quote unquote, independent foreign policy. And for a country like India, that was a big desire, that was a big wish, it was a real aspiration to have independent foreign policy. A country would have a foreign policy, but to have an independent foreign policy. And that was in the context of a colonial rule of more than 100 years or so, wherein Indians were subject to foreign policy decisions. Indians were subject to plunge into global affairs at the wish of our colonial masters. So whether it was a opium war in China, or it was a Boer war in Africa, or the First World War or Second World War, India became party to these wars not because of its own wish, not because of its own interest, but because the colonial masters wanted it to be. And that was something that India was very firm upon avoiding after getting the independence. That our foreign policy should be independent and it should not be tied to the global players. It should not be tied to the erstwhile colonial masters, was a very strong wish. And recently we could see that quite often we are again talking about strategic independence in our foreign policy, strategic autonomy in our foreign policy. So we could imagine that today, after 75 years of independence, if we are still concerned about losing our independence, our autonomy in foreign policy, what could have been the situation 75 years ago? The threat of manipulation at the hands of colonial masters, great powers, was real. And India indeed handled it quite well. And India was able to establish and practice its own independent foreign policy. The word non-alignment emerged much afterwards, but when in 1947 an Afro-Asian conference was summoned by Nehru in Delhi in 1947, the thought process was to help India to adopt an independent foreign policy. And that was a very big aspiration that India had at that point of time. The second aspiration that we had was what I would call as 3 Ds. The first D was about decolonization, second about denuclearization, and third about development. And we have been partially successful in achieving these 3 Ds in our aspirational foreign policy. While we have been extremely successful and commendable, it was for India to pursue the goal of complete decolonization of the world that ultimately was achieved in mid-1970s, and certainly a credit must go to India for persistently taking up the issues of decolonization. And that was something that was a phenomenal for a foreign policy of a country like India, that it was going beyond its narrow interests and trying to liberate people all across the world. And it was not merely a wish, but there was a strategy behind it, a strategy that was successfully implemented. And as a result of that, India contributed immensely in decolonizing the world. However, in terms of achieving the other 2 Ds, India was only partially successful. On the issue of denuclearization, it was on behalf of India, it was because of India's insistence. The world signed nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but as it was not up to the mark, it was not as India wanted it to be, India did not become party to nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So nuclear non-proliferation treaty partially achieved nuclear non-proliferation, but it was not a step towards the denuclearization of the world. And thus that agenda in India's aspirations remained unfulfilled. And on the third D of development, India's foreign policy tried to see that its economic policy, its relations with external countries, they would be linked to India's internal needs. First, it was about fulfilling our agricultural needs, fulfilling our needs of getting food grains from other countries, and at the same time getting technology, advancements in sciences to successfully usher into the green revolution. It was all part of India's foreign policy, something that began in early 1950s and was achieved in mid-1960s. This agenda played a significant role in India's foreign policy in terms of getting foreign assistance for technology development, in terms of getting science, the knowledge know-how for agricultural revolution. Indian foreign policy persistently pursued these matters with great powers, and despite its independent foreign policy and non-alignment that was not liked by great powers of the time, they partially assisted and helped India in achieving self-sufficiency in agriculture, in food grains, and also to lay down industrial foundations, technological foundations of the country. And at least partially we were successful on embarking on the path of development in terms of achieving our national goals. The third aspiration that we had was about playing a global role for ensuring world peace. Again, this was in the context of the two world wars that world has seen, and the Indian leadership was extremely unhappy with the way great powers they have taken, they have forced the world population into two world wars, and that proved to be catastrophic for not only the countries those fought those wars or who were at the center of those wars, but for the entire world. And therefore, from 1945-46 itself, India was talking about perpetual peace, trying to establish institutions, promoting institutions, being part of the institutions that would help in terms of establishing peace across the world. And if we look at India's foreign policy from 1947 at least till 1962, India played quite a constructive role, whether it was the Korean War, whether it was the Suez War of 1956, whether it was decolonization issue of Indonesia, etc. India's role was active. It was not a neutral role. It was an active role. India had proposals to resolve the issues, and India's opinions were taken quite seriously. And thus, India indeed was playing a role in terms of establishing a world peace. In fact, it is interesting to know that during our freedom movement, when we were arguing for our freedom, that why we should get freedom. One, it was a moral issue that why we should be slave of someone. It was also a political issue that politically we are capable of governing ourselves. It was also an economic issue that colonization had deprived us, not only deprived us, but had extracted all our resources and wealth from our country. And therefore, to do away with all these injustices, we wanted to have our independence. But if we look at the discourses of the time, the tall national leaders were always talking about if India would become independent, India would play its role in global affairs. This issue was referred to and mentioned in the Constituent Assembly debates by many stalwarts on many occasions. Whether it was about adoption of India's national flag, whether it was adoption of Article 51, whether it was approving Nehru's policies vis-a-vis Western countries, wherein Nehru argued for being part of the Commonwealth, pursuing independent foreign policy, but at the same time being part of the Commonwealth Association. So these issues were very strongly debated, referred to, discussed in the Constituent Assembly. And there was an unanimity that India has a capacity to play a global role to establish world peace. The so-called world powers of the time, for 50 years, they were failing to establish world peace. And in that context, then, India was aspiring to play that role. However, after 1962, mostly because of India-China war, India retreated to some extent from the global stage, and India began to concentrate more in its neighborhood and on the internal issues. And it was this unfulfilled aspiration that today we could see is playing its role. It is re-emerging in India's foreign policy, that we want to play a global role, that we are destined to play a global role. We have the capacity, we do have the vision to establish global peace, world peace, and that is something that India's foreign policy, it is trying to do today. That if there is one important aspiration of India's foreign policy, then that is about playing a global role, playing a role to establish peace everywhere and then usher the world into an era of new development. Similarly, the issue agenda of development was also not completely fulfilled. And as a result of that, we could see now India is referring to becoming a developed country, transforming itself from a developing country to the developed country. So at the time of independence, our aspiration was to usher into an era of development. That we did. But at that time, our aspiration was not to become a developed country. because we had no wherewithal about it. But today we do have wherewithal. Today we do have the capacity to transform ourselves into a developed country. So while earlier we were a proud developing country, now we want to do away with the tag of a developing country and we want to be a developed country. And these are the two unfulfilled aspirations of India's foreign policy that we are carrying into the new era. We are carrying into the 21st century, that we want to be a global player and we want to be a developed country now. No more doing with the developing tag. That has now become an aspiration of millions of Indians. Similarly, on the issue of denuclearization, as India realized that it was being isolated by the world powers on the issue of denuclearization, India changed the track. India changed the track in 1974, as prior to that, the world powers, the nuclear countries and many other countries, they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there was immense pressure on India to be signatory to Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. India demonstrated its power. It was not only a technological power, but it was a diplomatic capacity as well to test the nuclear weapon and withstand pressures from the nuclear powers. That India did in 1974, and thus India's aspirations on denuclearization also changed because of the external factors, that the world was not listening to India. And in that context, then India thought that India must demonstrate its capacity. And after 1991, there was also a realization, or rather India wanted to show it to the world, that the nuclear powers, they were justifying their nuclear weapons in the name of Cold War. They were justifying their nuclear weapons in the name of bipolarity. However, Cold War, at least at that point of time, ended that. The Cold War it happened because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the ideological rivalry was no more there in the world. And therefore, from 1945, the justification that was given by United States, by other European countries, by Soviet Union, by China to acquire nuclear weapon, it no longer existed. However, still after 1991, these countries did not do anything to denuclearize the world. And at that point of time, then India also decided that now was the time for India to acquire nuclear weapons, and thus India became nuclear in 1998 with the, again, aspiration of creating its own space in the world. And then it was realized that nuclear weapons would testify India's resolve to be a global power, to be a world power, and to play a role in world affairs. Today, the biggest aspiration of India, which is being reflected in its foreign policy, is with regard to getting recognition from the world to be not only a world power, not only a power that can play a role in global affairs, but also a rich civilization with continuous history of 5,000 years and something that the world can replicate, something that the world can learn from also. And in that quest, India is taking many initiatives that are reflected in different policies in the foreign policy domain. So when we say that India is now eager to get a recognition from the world, that it is a civilization of 5,000 years, that it wants to be a global player, etc. So how is it that India is trying to achieve this particular aspiration? So first of all, India is developing its soft power. India is developing its wherewithal about impressing the world about Indian civilization, about Indian value system, and Indian philosophy that can also be helpful to the world. So the promotion of yoga is part of it, promotion of Indian value system is part of it, promotion of Indian philosophy is part of it, and through that India again is reasserting itself, a project that began in late 19th century with Swami Vivekananda and later on with many of the leaders of the national movement, that India is much rich civilization than that of the Western countries. That project India is taking ahead with new vigor in 21st century now, and this has now become a great aspiration for India. And another way to achieve this aspiration is that India is trying to be a leader in the solar energy sector. India is also trying to be a leader in arm export area, wherein till this point of time, India was importing arms, but now India's aspirations are to export the arms to other countries. India wants to be part of nuclear suppliers group. India also wants to be part of the United Nations Security Council on a permanent basis. That these are some of the indicators that would prove that India has achieved what it wants to achieve. If India would become an NSG member, if India would become UN Security Council permanent member, if India would become a leader in export of arms, if India would become a leader in export of solar technology, and if India's soft power is being acknowledged by the world, these would be the indicators that India's aspirations are on the path of fulfillment. However, I would like to state that there are very serious shortcomings which can be done away with, which can be addressed to, and there are very serious dilemmas in our foreign policy that would prevent India from achieving its aspirations. I will first come to the shortcomings in our foreign policy, and there are at least 3 shortcomings that we are not addressing. We can, but we are not doing it. The very first is that to implement a foreign policy, you need arms, you need foots, you need heads, you need eyes, you need brains, and that is there in India's foreign policy. However, if we look at the size of India's foreign policy, it is nowhere to match aspirations of a country like India. The size of Great Britain's foreign policy establishment is minimum 4 times bigger than that of India's foreign policy establishment. We simply cannot compare it with China or United States or even with France and Russia. Their foreign policy establishments are much bigger than that of ours. Great Britain alone are having diplomats or officials who are serving in their foreign ministry up to 8,000 to 9,000, where we are still below 3,000 or so. Unless we increase our capacity in terms of human resources in our external affairs ministry and other wings that are important to implement foreign policy, we are not going to achieve our aspirations. Few years back, Shashi Tharoor floated a proposal that Indian Foreign Service should be separated from Indian Administrative Service or from the UPSC General Examination. It was a wonderful proposal. Nothing has been happened on that so far. But I think that time now has come that we must separate Indian Foreign Service and we must have dedicated people who are interested in international relations, foreign policy, world affairs, etc., who are really willing to contribute in achieving India's aspirations also. The second problem or second shortcoming in India's aspirations is that we lack world-class universities, we lack world-class research centers, we do not have independent think tanks. The think tanks in India, more or less, either they are under government influence or they are under influence of foreign donors or foreign funders. We do not have independent think tanks. And unless these independent think tanks, on a very rigorous basis, they would provide feedback, they would analyze government policies, we are really not going to achieve everything in our foreign policy. Similarly, we also do not have world-class media. Media has expanded in India, but we do not have a single media house that we could say is world class. We do not have our CNN, we do not have our BBC, we do not have our Al Jazeera. And unless we have it, we are not going to achieve our goals in foreign policy. And it is here that we are having a misperception about soft power of the country. We have this misconception that only Bollywood and yoga, they constitute the soft power. They do, but they are not sufficient to be the soft power. It is the intellectual prowess of the country. It is the universities, think tanks, research centers, your media that can influence not only your people, but that can influence people across the globe. That is your soft power. And this is a serious shortcoming in our foreign policy. The third shortcoming is that over the years, particularly under current regime, our foreign policy has become too much populist. Whatever we are doing in our foreign policy is to sell it to our people. That has become our top priority. Earlier, this was not the case. Earlier, the leaders would prepare the case and they would argue the case with the people of India and would try to convince them. Nehru was best example of it, wherein he would convince the entire country on the issue of denuclearization. He would convince the entire country on the issue of Indus Water Treaty with Pakistan. The public opinion might not be with the government, but government would have its own opinion about what is best in the national interest and would not do everything only to cater to the voters also. What is happening currently is that we are too much conscious of what voters would say, and we do not have the guts to tell truth to the voters that what is in our national interest in the long term. So we are basically playing to the sentiments and gallery of the people, which is not good for foreign policy of any country. So these are three shortcomings that we are currently having in our foreign policy, which would prevent us from achieving our aspirations. And along with that, there are at least two serious dilemmas and one what I would call as a division in our country that would prevent us from achieving our aspirations. These two dilemmas are, the first one is on the issue of globalization. So far, we have been party to globalization, but we were not leaders of globalization. And therefore, our position on globalization was sometimes we were willing party to globalization and sometimes we have lots of apprehensions on globalization. Now the situation has changed. Now there is no leader of globalization. Countries who were leading globalization, they themselves have become apprehensive about globalization. And therefore, while earlier countries like India were taking position on globalization vis-a-vis policies of these developed countries, United States, European countries, etc., now those countries themselves have become apprehensive on globalization. And therefore, we now cannot have this position that globalization is going, that we will be willing or half-hearted, unwilling or half-hearted partner in the journey of globalization. So either we have to take a firm position against globalization or we have to champion globalization, something that China is doing now. And we are still hesitating in doing that. That's a very serious dilemma that we are having. It got reflected in we not signing the RCEP. I'm not going into merits and demerits of RCEP. But if we are championing globalization, we cannot stay away from arrangements like RCEP. And if we do not want to be part of RCEP, we cannot champion globalization. So this is a dilemma that we have not been able to resolve. Rather, I would say we have not tried to resolve this particular dilemma in our foreign policy. The second dilemma is much more serious, and that is with regard to our neighborhood. And in neighborhood, again, there are three elements. The first one is our neighborhood minus Pakistan minus China. And dilemma with regard to this neighborhood, minus China, minus Pakistan, is how do we want to treat them? How do we want to position ourselves vis-a-vis these smaller neighboring countries? So for a larger part, we inherited a legacy of British Raj, wherein under British arrangement, we were the bigger partner and they were smaller partner and were basically telling the British India in South Asia or so. Now, over the years, these countries, they have also developed their own aspirations. And we still have not decided that how we should treat them. And therefore, our policy, it has been vacillating between treating them at par, at equal, and becoming hegemon in South Asia. We have not been able to resolve this particular dilemma so far. This dilemma was there at the time of Indira Gandhi, it was there at the time of Rajiv Gandhi, and it is very much there at the time of Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi as well. The second issue with regard to neighborhood is the question of Pakistan, that how do we want to tackle Pakistan. And what's happening regarding Pakistan is that we do not have a consistent policy vis-a-vis Pakistan, and our policy vis-a-vis Pakistan changes whenever position of prime minister also gets changed. So every prime minister is trying to reinvent the wheel vis-a-vis Pakistan, and every prime minister is then falling back on not talking to Pakistan. So this is something that we have not been able to address seriously. So what Rajiv Gandhi did, what Narasimha Rao did, what Atal Bihari Vajpayee did, what Manmohan Singh did, and what Narendra Modi did, it's same. We will talk to Pakistan, we will not talk to Pakistan. We will talk to Pakistan, we will not talk to Pakistan. We are not moving ahead in deciding our policy vis-a-vis Pakistan. And that is something that is pulling down us in international relations. And the third issue vis-a-vis neighborhood is, of course, what Supriyatai was also referring to, was the issue of China. Now, regarding China, we face two serious dilemmas. The first dilemma is that if we have to tackle China, if we have to handle China, whether to enter into anti-China alliance or not. Now, there is a strong opinion in India. Government is not in favor of it. Whichever party's government, that is not in favor of it. But if you look at discourses in various think tanks, if you look at discourses in English media, many are arguing for that. It is because of Indian government's insistence, Quad has not become a military alliance. Otherwise, US wants it to be a military alliance, Japan, Australia, all of them, they want it to be a military alliance, and many within Indian foreign policy establishment and think tanks, they want it to be a military alliance, but Indian government is very firm that it should not be a military alliance, whether it was Manmohan Singh's government or Narendra Modi's government. So that is a one question that is going to face us, that how we are going to tackle China, whether to be part of anti-China alliance or whether to have our own ways of tackling China. And the second issue regarding China is that for long, from 1991 till 2020, almost for 30 years, both of us, India and China, we were batting for multipolar world order. Now we are no longer batting, we are no longer arguing for multipolar world order, because there is a realization that this multipolar world order also would be hierarchical one, wherein US would be on the top, China would be catching up with the US, and then there would be huge disparity between US, China on the one hand, and the other aspiring powers, other great powers in the world. India certainly would be in the league at third or fourth number, but the distance between China as a pole and India as a pole, it will be very big. And therefore, we are now not talking about multipolar world. And therefore, there is no clarity that what type of world we want to achieve. And that is a serious dilemma that we are facing vis-a-vis our neighborhood, Pakistan and China. And the third and last issue regarding achieving our aspirations is, I would not call it as a dilemma, but it is a division that has happened in our society. And the division is on the line of whether we want to be like the world or whether we want the world to be like us. आपल्याला जगाला आपल्यासारखं बनवायचं आहे की आपण जगासारखे बनणार आहोत. This is a serious division that is there. When we began our journey in 1947, we wanted the world to be like us, believing in the principle of democracy, inclusivity, secularism, social justice, development, etc. Today is the most ripe time for India to showcase Indian secularism, Indian inclusivity, and Indian democracy to the world. On all these counts, on secularism, democracy, and inclusivity, so-called founders of democracy in the world, they are faltering. United States is faltering, and all the European countries are faltering, including France, where the French Revolution had taken place, giving the slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity or so. But we, from 1947 onwards, practiced these principles in a distinct way, in an Indian way. And today we can show to the world that this is the way how you should practice these principles. However, what is happening or what has happened is that now we want to be like a Turkey, we want to be like Erdogan's Turkey, or we want to be like China, we want to be like Xi Jinping's China, or we want to be like Donald Trump's America. Not America, but Donald Trump's America or so. And that is something that is not taking India's foreign policy and India ahead in international relations and in the global affairs. So these are the serious dilemmas and divisions that we are facing in achieving aspirations in our foreign policy. And regarding this, why it is not being addressed is simply because we do not have a culture of political dialogue in our country. We have vibrant democracy, we have vibrant political party system, but we still lack the culture of political dialogue in our country. Last time we seriously debated and discussed foreign policy issues on the national scale was, I think it was the nuclear deal with United States. And since then, we are evading a national debate on concrete issues, which is not good, which is not healthy for a democracy and for an aspiring country like India. We do not have debate and dialogue on how to resolve the Kashmir issue. We do not have debate and dialogue on the issue of how to resolve a border dispute with China. There is no unanimity. We do not know exactly what is our solution. Even if we want to engage China and even if we want to resolve the border dispute, we do not know what ultimately we want to achieve. Because this has never been told to us by any establishment, by any government, even by any political party, that this is the solution that we are proposing to resolve India-China border dispute, or this is the solution that we are proposing to resolve the Kashmir dispute also. And it is this lack of political dialogue that also will be proven costly for us to achieve our aspirations. And in this overall context, I certainly would like to say that the kind of initiative that Yashwantrao Chauhan Center has taken in starting this dialogue, Mumbai dialogue, what we require is hundreds of Mumbai dialogues within Mumbai and outside Mumbai, across the country also. Unless and until all our cities and towns, they would be discussing these issues, we would really not be able to really work on our aspirations. They remain our dreams, but not our aspirations. Thank you. Thank you so much.